The Nexus Prime Military Academy possessed all the architectural grandeur one might expect from an institution designed to train the galaxy's future tactical officers. Crystalline spires stretched toward 3 separate suns, their surfaces reflecting the gentle aurora of the planet's magnetosphere in ways that would make lesser civilizations weep with aesthetic joy. The fact that most of the Academy's students found the view boring enough to sleep through morning lectures said everything one needed to know about the supposed sophistication of advanced galactic society. Commander Zephrix of the Altarian Defense Corps stood before his Tactical Response 101 class, his forearms gesticulating in practiced academic flourishes, while his translator collar rendered his chittering speech into perfectly enunciated galactic standard. The irony that a species which had achieved faster-than-light travel 3 millennia ago still needed machines to talk to each other was lost on precisely no one, yet mentioned by exactly nobody. Such was the nature of polite interstellar relations. Today, we examine crisis management protocols when dealing with primitive species integration scenarios, Zephrix announced, his compound eyes scanning the assembled students with a sort of benevolent condescension that made him popular at faculty mixes. As you all know, the Galactic Concordat's recent expansion has brought several pre-warp civilizations under our protective umbrella. The classroom buzzed with the sort of low-level chatter that suggested most students were either updating their social feeds or mentally cataloging which of their classmates they planned to mate with after graduation. Standard academic engagement, really. The assembled beings represented 17 different species, all of whom had mastered interstellar politics, quantum engineering, and the fine art of looking attentive while thinking about lunch. All except one. Kira Valdez sat in the back corner, her remarkably unremarkable human features drawing about as much attention as a particularly bland nutrition paste. The Human Exchange Program had been the Concordat's latest attempt at cultural outreach, a feel-good initiative designed to show the galaxy how wonderfully inclusive they were toward species that still used chemical propulsion and found fire impressive. Most faculty members treated the program like a cosmic petting zoo, complete with the sort of patronizing head pats one might give to a clever pet that had learned to use eating utensils. Kira appeared to be taking notes, though closer inspection would reveal she was actually sketching surprisingly detailed schematics of the classroom's ventilation system. Her pen moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about structural vulnerabilities, a habit that would have concerned her instructors if they had bothered to pay attention to anything beyond her species' adorable primitive status. Now then, Zephrix continued, activating the holographic display with a flourish that suggested he had practiced the gesture in front of a mirror, let us examine today's scenario. The air above his desk shimmered and resolved into a 3-dimensional representation of a standard orbital facility. The structure hung in space like a mechanical flower, all gentle curves and aesthetically pleasing architecture that screamed designed by committee in 17 different languages. According to the display's technical readout, the station housed 200 civilian researchers studying something appropriately boring like xenobotany or interspecies poetry appreciation. This is Research Station Harmony, Zephrix announced with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested he had missed his calling as a holodrama narrator. Yesterday, it was seized by a group of Vorthan pirates. 12 individuals, heavily armed, holding the civilian population hostage while they attempt to access the station's data cores. A student in the front row, a crystalline whose species name sounded like breaking glass being fed through a synthesizer, raised what might charitably be called a hand. Commander, surely the standard negotiation protocols would apply here? The Vorthan culture responds well to displays of superior technology and economic incentives. Excellent observation, resonance of distant stars, Zephrix replied, which was either the student's actual name or a particularly pretentious way of saying Bob. What other approaches might we consider? Another student, this one a tall, ethereal being whose species had evolved beyond the need for solid matter and consequently looked like a fashion model made of aurora, offered their thoughts. Perhaps a demonstration of our defensive capabilities? A show of force that encourages surrender without actual violence. Very good, wisp of solar winds. Any other suggestions? The discussion continued in this vein for several minutes, each proposal more civilized and reasonable than the last. Surgical strikes that disabled weapons without harming anyone. Technological solutions that rendered the pirates unconscious through advanced stun fields. economic negotiations that addressed the root causes of piracy through social rehabilitation programs. It was all very enlightened, very progressive, and about as practical as using a quantum entanglement communicator to order pizza. Zephrix nodded approvingly at each suggestion, his compound eyes glittering with the satisfaction of an educator watching his students demonstrate their moral superiority over the violent chaos of less advanced civilizations. This was exactly the sort of response he expected from beings whose species had transcended the crude, barbaric impulses that still plagued primitive worlds. All excellent approaches, he said finally, then made the mistake that would haunt his dreams for the next several decades. But let us consider alternative perspectives. Perhaps our exchange student might offer insights from her cultural background. The classroom fell silent with the sort of awkward quiet that usually preceded either profound wisdom or spectacular social catastrophe. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward the human in the back corner, most expressing the sort of polite curiosity one might show toward a zoo exhibit that had unexpectedly started juggling. Kira looked up from her sketching, blinked once, and asked with a casual tone one might use to inquire about the weather, "Do you want survivors?" The question hung in the air like a toxic gas cloud at a dinner party. Several students exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely sure they had heard correctly. Zephrix's translator collar made a small buzzing sound, as if the device was questioning its own linguistic capabilities. "I'm sorry," Zephrix said slowly. "Could you clarify that question?" Kira set down her pen and leaned back in her chair with the sort of relaxed posture that suggested she was about to discuss something no more controversial than lunch plans. "Well, it's just that the approach depends entirely on the desired outcome. Are we prioritizing the rescue of all civilians, most civilians, or just enough civilians to call it a successful operation? Are we concerned about infrastructure damage to the station? Do we need any of the pirates alive for intelligence purposes? Are there political considerations about how this gets reported?" The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational field. Somewhere in the distance, a quantum processor hummed with the sort of electronic confusion that suggested even the computers were struggling to process what they had just heard. That is to say, naturally we want to preserve all civilian lives, Zephrix managed, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was beginning to suspect he had made a terrible mistake. "Right, but that's not actually what I asked," Kira replied with cheerful persistence. "Look, if you want zero civilian casualties, minimal infrastructure damage, and all the pirates taken alive for trial, that's one approach. If you want the station back online as quickly as possible and don't particularly care about the pirates' welfare, that's a completely different approach. If you want to send a message to other potential pirate groups about what happens when you mess with Concordat facilities, that's a third approach entirely." Resonance of distant stars made a sound like wind chimes having an existential crisis. Surely the moral choice is obvious. We preserve all life and pursue justice through proper legal channels. Kira nodded thoughtfully. "Sure, that's definitely the most ethical approach. It's also the most time-consuming, expensive, and likely to result in future incidents. But if those are acceptable trade-offs, then absolutely, go with the negotiation route." "What would you suggest?" Zephrix asked, and immediately regretted it with the intensity of a collapsing star. Kira brightened visibly, like a student who had finally been asked about her favorite subject. "Well, if we're prioritizing speed and deterrent effect, I'd probably start by cutting life support to sections of the station where the pirates are located. Not enough to kill them immediately, just enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Then I'd use the station's artificial gravity generators to create localized gravitational anomalies. Nothing fatal, just enough to make standing up difficult and induce severe nausea." The classroom had achieved a level of silence typically reserved for the vacuum of space. Several students were making the sort of facial expressions usually seen during particularly graphic medical procedures. While they are dealing with that, Kira continued conversationally, "I'd access the station's communication systems and start broadcasting the last recorded messages from previous pirates who made similar career choices. You know, the screaming, the begging, the inevitable acceptance of their fate. Really sets the mood." Previous pirates. Wispy of SolarWinds asked in a voice that suggested they were beginning to question their major in interspecies relations. "Oh sure, there are always previous pirates. The galaxy's a big place, and someone's always trying to steal something from someone else. The key is making sure word gets around about what happens when you target the wrong people. Kira pulled up her sketches and showed them to the class. See, I've been mapping the station's structural weak points. If you overload the power coupling here and here, you can create a feedback loop that makes the entire hub ring uninhabitable without actually breaching the hull. Forces everyone into the central core, where you can control access to food, water, and breathable atmosphere. Zephrix stared at the sketches with a sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular traffic accidents. The diagrams were disturbingly thorough, complete with calculations for oxygen depletion rates and optimal pressure differentials for psychological impact. But what about the civilians? Resonance of distant stars managed to whisper. What about them? Kira asked, genuinely puzzled. They are not the ones threatening people with weapons. You evacuate them to secure sections first, obviously. I mean, I'm not suggesting we terrorize innocent researchers. That would be counterproductive and morally wrong. The distinction between terrorizing armed pirates and not terrorizing innocent civilians seemed to provide exactly zero comfort to anyone in the room. Perhaps, Zephrix said carefully, you could walk us through your proposed solution step by step. It was the sort of request that, in retrospect, he would rank among the top 5 worst decisions of his long and otherwise distinguished career. Right up there with the time he had volunteered to test experimental faster-than-light engines and the incident with the Arcturian ambassador's daughter. Kira's face lit up with the sort of enthusiasm typically seen in young mammals discovering recreational activities. Absolutely. Mind if I use the simulation system? Before anyone could object, she had connected her personal datapad to the classroom's tactical display. The peaceful image of Research Station Harmony flickered and was replaced by what appeared to be a real-time schematic covered in blinking red indicators and trajectory calculations. Okay, so first things first, Kira began, her fingers dancing across the interface with practiced efficiency. We identify the pirates' location and movement patterns. The simulation shows they've made the classic mistake of bunching up in defensible positions instead of spreading out to maximize their hostage value. The display zoomed in on several sections of the station where red dots clustered together like particularly aggressive bacteria. See how they've barricaded themselves in the main labs and the central computer core? Tactically sound for defense, terrible for maintaining operational effectiveness once the environment becomes hostile. Hostile environment? Zephrix asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Right. So step 1 is environmental manipulation, Kira continued cheerfully. We start by gradually reducing oxygen content in their sections while increasing carbon dioxide. Nothing dramatic, just enough to impair cognitive function and induce mild panic responses. Simultaneously, we're adjusting the lighting to strobe at frequencies known to cause disorientation and headaches. The simulation displayed a timeline showing oxygen levels dropping from normal to what the readout helpfully labeled as consciousness impairment threshold. Several students made small, distressed noises. Step 2 is sensory disruption, Kira continued, apparently oblivious to her audience's growing horror. The station's internal communication system gets repurposed to broadcast a mix of subsonic frequencies that induce anxiety and recorded sounds of whatever the Vorthan species finds most psychologically disturbing. For humans, it would be things like children crying off fingernails on chalkboards, but I'm not sure what works for Vorthan specifically. The sound of their birth eggs cracking, whisper of solar winds offered weakly, then immediately looked like they regretted contributing to the conversation. Perfect. So we broadcast cracking egg sounds at random intervals, while simultaneously manipulating the station's artificial gravity to create intermittent periods of weightlessness. The combination of auditory distress, respiratory difficulty, and spatial disorientation should reduce their combat effectiveness by approximately 60% within the first hour. The tactical display now showed a complex web of environmental controls, audio feeds, and atmospheric readings that looked less like a rescue operation and more like a particularly elaborate form of psychological torture. Which, the more Zephrix thought about it, was probably exactly what it was. Step 3 is where things get interesting, Kira said, and the entire class simultaneously leaned away from her with the sort of synchronized movement usually seen in nature documentaries about herd animals avoiding predators. We start introducing false information into their communication channels. Reports of Concordat battle fleets approaching, rumors that their employer has abandoned them, fabricated transmissions suggesting that other pirate groups are planning to eliminate them to claim the bounty on their heads. The key is to make them paranoid about everyone, including each other. The simulation now displayed a complex network of fake communications, fabricated intelligence reports, and psychological manipulation tactics that would have impressed military intelligence officers from a dozen different species, several of whom would have then immediately requested transfers to different departments. By this point, they are dealing with impaired breathing, constant disorientation, auditory trauma, and complete uncertainty about their situation. Kira continued with a sort of methodical precision that suggested she had given this considerable thought. Step 4 is when we offer them a way out. Thank the cosmos, resonance of distant stars muttered. Finally some mercy. Kira looked at them with genuine confusion. Mercy? Oh no. This is when we give them false hope and then crush it systematically. We open communication channels and offer safe passage in exchange for the hostages. Then when they agree, we spring the trap. The words "spring the trap" were delivered with such casual cheerfulness that they seemed to hang in the air like a toxic cloud. Zephrix found himself wondering if it was too late to request a transfer to the Concordat's Department of Xenobotany, where the most dangerous thing he would have to deal with was the occasional carnivorous plant. What sort of trap? He heard himself ask, though his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Well, that depends on whether we want them alive or not, Kira replied, and then seemed to notice the expressions on everyone's faces for the first time. I mean, obviously alive is preferable for intelligence gathering, but it's more complicated logistically. She manipulated the display to show what appeared to be a detailed schematic of the station's docking bay. If we want them alive, we modify the shuttle they are planning to escape in. Nothing too dramatic, just some adjustments to the life support system that will render them unconscious once they are safely away from the station. Then we collect them at our leisure. And if we don't want them alive? Wisp of Solar Winds asked in the sort of faint voice that suggested they were regretting their life choices. Kira brightened considerably. Oh, that's much simpler. We just programmed the shuttle to suffer a catastrophic system failure about 30 seconds after launch. Looks like an accident. Sends a clear message to any other pirates who might be considering similar ventures, and saves the Concordat the expense of a trial and incarceration. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to have achieved its own form of consciousness. Somewhere in the depths of space, a quantum fluctuation occurred that was probably less disturbing than what had just been described in Tactical Response 101. The beauty of this approach, Kira continued, apparently mistaking stunned horror for rapt attention, is that it's completely scalable. Larger pirate groups just require more environmental manipulation and a bigger selection of psychological pressure points. The basic principle remains the same: control their environment, eliminate their options, and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities until surrender becomes the only rational choice. She turned off the display and looked around the classroom with the sort of satisfied expression usually seen on students who had just delivered what they considered to be a particularly brilliant presentation. Any questions? The questions, as it turned out, were numerous and deeply disturbing. They range from what if they have hostages in the same sections, to how do you know so much about psychological torture techniques, to are all humans like this? Kira answered each inquiry with the sort of patient thoroughness that suggested she had given these matters considerable thought, which somehow made everything worse. By the time the class period ended, half the students had requested immediate transfers to different courses, 3 had applied for medical leave, and Resonance of Distant Stars had apparently decided to change their major to something less stressful, like stellar cartography or existential philosophy. Zephrix remained in the classroom long after the last student had fled, staring at the tactical display where Kira's simulation results still glowed with cheerful efficiency. According to the computer's analysis, her approach would have resolved the hostage situation in approximately 4 hours with 0 civilian casualties, minimal infrastructure damage, and a 100% capture rate of the pirates. It was, by any objective measure, a perfect solution. It was also absolutely terrifying. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication from the Academy's administrative offices. Zephrix activated the channel and found himself looking at the concerned compound eyes of Dean Quix for Nexus, whose expression suggested she had been monitoring the class remotely. "Commander," she said without preamble, "we need to discuss the human exchange program." "I was just thinking the same thing," Zephrix replied, his voice carrying the sort of weary resignation usually reserved for beings who had just witnessed the heat death of the universe. "This is the 7th incident this month," the Dean continued. "Last week, the human in advanced strategic planning suggested solving food distribution problems by eliminating inefficient populations. The week before that, one of them proposed resolving trade disputes through aggressive economic warfare that would have destabilized half the sector." Zephrix nodded slowly. "What did the Ethics Committee say about today's presentation?" "They are requesting hazard pay and psychological counseling for anyone who has to review the recordings." Apparently, the humans' casual discussion of environmental torture techniques caused 3 committee members to experience what their species' equivalent of panic attacks. The 2 academics sat in contemplative silence for several moments, each wrestling with the implications of what they had witnessed. Finally, Dean Quix for Nexus spoke again. "Commander, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, Dean." "Do you think the humans know what they are doing?" It was an excellent question, and one that had been bothering Zephrix ever since Kira had cheerfully described her step-by-step plan for psychological manipulation and environmental control. The human had presented her solution with the sort of matter-of-fact professionalism that suggested this was perfectly normal thinking for her species. "I think," Zephrix said slowly, "that they know exactly what they are doing. And I think that's what scares me the most." The Dean's expression somehow managed to convey both understanding and existential dread simultaneously. "The Concordat Council is beginning to question the wisdom of the exchange program. There are concerns that we may be inadvertently training these humans in advanced warfare techniques." "Training them?" Zephrix laughed, though the sound held no humor whatsoever. "Dean, with all due respect, I don't think we're training them in anything. I think they are showing us capabilities they already possess." It was a sobering thought. The Galactic Concordat had invited humans into their military academies as part of a cultural exchange program designed to demonstrate their enlightened approach to primitive species integration. The idea had been to expose these younger civilizations to advanced military theory and ethical warfare principles, hopefully accelerating their social development while showcasing the Concordat's benevolent guidance. Instead, they seemed to have invited a species of tactical savants who approached warfare with a sort of creative ruthlessness that made seasoned military officers question their career choices. "There's something else," the Dean continued. "I've been reviewing the applications for next semester's exchange program. We're expecting 12 more humans." Zephrix felt something that might have been his soul leaving his body. 12. 12. All of them with military backgrounds. All of them specifically interested in what they call asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics. The implications hung in the air like a particularly ominous storm cloud. If one human exchange student could traumatize an entire classroom with a casual approach to hostage rescue, what would a dozen of them do to the Academy's carefully structured curriculum? "Dean," Zephrix said carefully, "perhaps we should consider revising the exchange program parameters." "It's too late for that. The agreements have been signed. The political commitments have been made. The Concordat Council sees this as a crucial test of our commitment to inclusive military cooperation." Zephrix closed his compound eyes and tried to imagine explaining to his superiors that the human exchange program was systematically undermining thousands of years of civilized military doctrine. It was not a conversation he was looking forward to. "There's one other thing," the Dean added, and her tone suggested that whatever she was about to say would not improve Zephrix's mood. "The human student, Kira Valdez, has requested permission to audit advanced combat engineering and psychological operations." "Psychological operations," Zephrix repeated faintly. "Apparently, she wants to learn about more sophisticated approaches to enemy demoralization." Her exact words. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm chimed softly, indicating the start of the next class period. Soon, The corridors would fill with eager young beings from across the galaxy, all of them preparing for careers in the noble art of civilized warfare. All of them blissfully unaware that their fundamental assumptions about military ethics and tactical doctrine were about to be systematically challenged by a species that treated psychological torture as a routine problem-solving technique. Zephrix gathered his materials and prepared to face his next class, wondering if it was too late to pursue that career in xenobotany he had always dreamed about. At least carnivorous plants had the decency to be straightforward about their intentions. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at the tactical display, where Kira's simulation results still glowed with cold efficiency. 4 hours, 0 civilian casualties, complete mission success. It was everything the Concordat claimed to value in military operations. The fact that it involved systematically terrorizing sentient beings until they surrendered was, apparently, just a minor implementation detail. He had the sudden, uncomfortable suspicion that the galaxy was about to learn some very important lessons about the difference between being civilized and being effective, and that these lessons would be taught by a species that had somehow managed to be both simultaneously. The instructor had asked, "What would you do here?" She had said, "Depends. Do you want survivors?" As Zephrix walked toward his next class, he found himself wondering if that question was about to become disturbingly relevant to the future of galactic warfare itself. After all, the humans were just getting started.